and we're back. So we were kind of touching on something, talking about the survival part of the brain, or more primitive part, some people might refer to it, versus the logical and everything else. I actually heard this phrase before. People call it survival mode. You know, my wife's actually touched on this before. She's like, sometimes I just feel like survival mode. Like, you can go to somebody, and these are people you can go to and be like, hey, do you mind cleaning up after yourself? And they immediately want to defend themselves. I didn't make that mess. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. I'm like, oh, okay, fine, but the mess still needs to get cleaned up.
Right.
You know, it doesn't change the fact that I'm not asking you who did it. I'm not asking you who made this mistake. I'm not asking you, could you clean this up for me because I'm doing something else? You know, but they immediately go very defensive. Do you think, when you're looking at survival mode and that kind of stuff, you talked about, you know, maybe it's the way you were raised or something like that, where it kind of triggers that portion of you to get very defensive. Is finding the source, like, is that key to depression? Is that key to being defensive? Like, figuring out why it happens or why you feel this way?
Why we get into those same cycles?
Yeah.
Well, the thing that people don't necessarily think about is the fact that they have all of these different signs that appear as they approach the cycle, right? Mm-hmm. These things that go, uh-oh, here we go again, right? So it automatically says, by the time I get to here, whatever this arbitrary sign is, in our subconscious, we basically just go, when we get to here, then that's when we're going to put our guard up and the usual stuff is going to happen. Mm-hmm. So it's. Do I recommend that you find out what the source of that depression is? Absolutely. But that's a longer process. What it's about is recognizing the signs and taking that exit before you get there, because ultimately I kind of liken it to SWAT training, right? You're doing all this training so that when the shit goes down, you kick right into gear, right? Mm-hmm. Well, ultimately that's the idea is this fight, flight, faint, or freeze portion of your brain. If you can recognize the signs that get you close to that, you can say, okay, when this happens, I'm going to walk away, right? I'm gonna withdraw from this situation because I know that going down this normal path, this is what happens, right? So it's recognizing the basest reaction and sort of training yourself to do that so that you just don't go into that same cycle, right? You say, okay, instead of normally we'd come home from, like if you're talking about a couple or something like that, normally we'd come home from work, and when we got there, we just immediately start arguing. Well, if you change up how you're going to do that in a way where you recognize these first couple of steps and what needs to happen at this critical point, rather than going, by the time we get all the way to the house, we're automatically fighting. If you are able to divert yourself to a spot where like if you're telling your significant other, hey, when this happens, I'm gonna go withdraw. It doesn't mean that I don't care about you. It doesn't mean that I don't, like you create this idea that this means I'm not running away from us. I'm moving from the situation so as it doesn't follow that same.
Yeah, I've seen that before with couples and stuff where someone's like, okay, I'm going for a drive. And the other one immediately goes into survival mode. If you leave, we're if you leave, we're done, we're over. And so the husband or the wife would reassure them and be like, no, hold on, I'm coming back. I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I just need to go decompress for a little bit. Right. I'm coming back, I'll be back within an hour. I'm just going to go for, just that reassurance to kind of let the survival mode know, hey, no, that's not where we're at. We're not being this elevated right now. I'm doing this, and I will be coming back. I love you very much. And I find even with depression, reassurance matters for a lot of people. Just reminding them. I don't know if it's insecurity. I don't know where it comes from, but I find that just sometimes taking that extra moment to touch somebody and be like, hey, no, it's okay. I understand what you're feeling, or I don't understand what you're feeling, but I understand it's an issue. Okay, I'm going to address it. I'm going to take you seriously.
It's called validation.
Yeah, but this is what I need. This. I still need you to clean up this mess. Like whatever it is.
It's you exist. Your feelings are valid, like that type of stuff. And I that's the very when I tell people that I'm not a very patches on the sleeves, tell me about your mother type. But there are some bumper stickery type stuff that when I say them, it means it actually is true, right? Got to validate. People got to know that they exist, right? They got to know that they're not being discarded, because when they sink back into that hole, everything that they look at out of their eyes is very depressed, right? Like you can see, you'll be able to find the misery in pretty much everything. And if you don't validate somebody, I mean, take special care to go, you know what, everything's going to be okay. I don't know what you're going through, but I know that I can tell you're going through something, like that type of thing. You want to be able to let them, not only, you're not just telling them as a sort of this cycle that you get into. You're not just telling them, you're making sure that they heard you, understood you, accepted what you said, right? Because that connection, it's not just about saying the words, right? You can write it down on a piece of paper all you want. They got to believe you. Right? So they've got to be able to find, a depressed person has to be able to find at least one resource that can just pull them off that foundation that their feet are starting to like sink down into, right? And it's easier said than done.
So how do we recognize the difference between, okay, I'm depressed because my cat died, versus I have clinical depression and I may need more help than rather than just going for a walk. Right.
Well, there's a difference between grief and depression, right?
Right.
People grieve the passing of a loved one, or and that is completely normal, right? But we throw around the word depression a lot when that doesn't necessarily mean that what it is, because depression is specific signs that last over a very set amount of time, right? In fact, I'll bring up the actual DSM definition here in a bit, but ultimately what it comes down to is it's a sustained sense of deep sadness without any type of, there's anhedonia is basically no pleasure, and they don't take pleasure in things, they don't want to do anything anymore, and it's that pervasive. It's not only pervasive and deep, but it's for a particular length of time.
Yeah, the way I've described it, and by all means, correct me if you're wrong. You're the expert. I'm not. But I've told people, I was like, look, if it's one thing to be depressed because, or anxious or whatever, because there's a reason for it. You have a job interview, a loved one just died. Your house is a mess. You don't feel like cleaning it up. There's a reason why. And then there's depressed and you don't have a reason. Or you're anxious and there's no reason for it. Like someone who's bipolar. You could just be walking, cleaning up, doing your thing. All of a sudden, next thing you know, you feel really sad and you want to cry. And so that's the way I've kind of described it to people. I'm like, if you think you have clinical depression, it's usually not triggered by anything. You just feel miserable for whatever reason. Well,
you can tell the difference between this deep, pervasive sadness that makes you go, I don't even want to get out of bed right now. Just and there is bound to be some. When I say reason, I'm not talking like that. That core, that one thing. There's a lot of stuff where people have, traumatic history that basically has just been sort of nestled down in there. And eventually, with a traumatic history, all the stuff the cops see, some of these cops have got some really bad childhood upbringings, and what it comes down to is that bill is going to come due at some point, right? It's not, you don't get to forget, you do not get to forget that stuff and just go, oh, well, I'll be totally fine. It doesn't work that way. You've got to be able to address it. And whether you address it early and sort of be open to the experiences you're going to have to sort of get through in order to take care of it, or you wait till the very end and on your deathbed you have to deal with all that regret. Think about all those, the difference between those two times. I think I'd rather deal with it when I'm physically and mentally capable of handling.
Yeah, but how do you convince somebody? I mean, cops, you got that type A personality, that pride. I'm not the victim. I help people. I serve people. I attack the evil you pretend like doesn't exist. How do you tell that guy, hey man, you're dealing with something and you need to get mushy-gushy and go get in a room with somebody and talk about it?
Well, you can't come at somebody with the mushy-gushy stuff because that is an instant turnoff. If you think about what we just talked about with the big brain, little brain thing, right? If I come up with the mushy-gushy stuff, there's a part in his brain that just automatically turns that off and says, I'm not open to what you're talking about right now. Right. So it's about being able that initial sort of therapeutic connection is the most important, because like you talked about when I first got here, right? I don't look like your typical therapist, right? Because if I did, the typical therapist would instantly, the cop would just go, no.
It might be a turnoff to a cop or a military, whoever is like,
Right.
yeah, I'm not doing this. This isn't me. You
Right.
know?
Well, the thing is, this isn't a uniform for me. I'm not dressed like this to appeal to the audience.
You appeal to me.
It's just because, but it's just who I am, right? So you have to be there's a genuineness that you have to be in order for a cop to believe you, right?
Right.
Ultimately what it comes down to is building a trust with a person whose job it is to be investigative and to, basically sniff out the bullshit is what you have to get past, right? Because there's all this stuff that's going on with them is the container is completely full and it's all just tied up together like that. So once you get past that initial sort of connection, then that work starts, and that shield that they were using to protect themselves can come up at a moment's notice.
What would you say? Like, I'm not a trained therapist. I'm not a professional in any way, shape, or form. But let's say I recognize it. Would an indirect approach work? Like, hey man, let's go. Let's go get some lunch. Let's why don't you come over and we can watch a fight on the TV or something like that. Would you encourage someone to have an indirect approach to see if you can get someone to open up and maybe admit that, hey, maybe I have a problem or something like that? Or,
well, if you think about how cops are kind of dealing with that stuff right now anyway, in their own way, right? How many times have you seen choir practice, right? People, they get together and they when you hear cops tell stories about the things that actually happen, you realize that those stories it's their version of therapy, right? It sounds like they're bragging, but in fact they want somebody else to go, holy crap, that happened to you, like that. They want to feel that sort of kinship, that somebody understands, that somebody's as shocked by the thing that they saw as they were, right? And they do it that way because that's the socially acceptable way to do it in that setting, right? But ultimately what it comes down to is you've got to look at the specific situation and the specific person and the shields that they hold up and the way they do it, right? So it's not just like I can go, oh, well, all cops do this or all cops. No, each person is an individual and they each have their own ways that they sort of protect themselves. Because like I said, it goes right back to that very basic, how do they survive, right? And so finding out how they survive can give you some insight on how they want it to, or how you can kind of weave your way down into what is bothering them and what is keeping them from being happy.